why the education system exists. It's not what you think. Imagine this. You're 6 years old, full of energy, questions, imagination, and curiosity. You ask why the sky is blue, what happens when we die, why adults lie, why rules feel unfair. But instead of being encouraged, you're told to sit down, be quiet, raise your hand, and follow instructions. You're not punished for being wrong, you're punished for being original. And over time, you learn something far more powerful than math or grammar. You learn obedience. You learn compliance. You learn how to adapt to a system that wasn't built for your freedom, but for your control. Let's be honest. When we talk about education, most of us still believe it's about knowledge. That schools exist to teach us how to think, how to understand the world, how to prepare for the future. But what if that's not the real reason? What if the structure of modern education was never about enlightenment, but about domestication? What if it's not broken at all, but doing exactly what it was designed to do?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
This is where Noam Chomsky enters. He's not just one of the greatest linguists of all time, he's also one of the most radical critics of manufactured consent, propaganda, and institutional control. And his argument is chilling. The education system is not a neutral space, but it's a tool, a machine, a system designed not to liberate minds, but to mold them to produce obedient workers, passive citizens, and compliant consumers. And once you begin to see this, it's impossible to unsee it. Let's start with the structure. Almost every school system in the industrialized world follows the same model: bells, schedules, rows of desks, standardized testing, authority figures who aren't to be questioned. But where did this come from? Not from ancient philosophy. Not from any democratic ideal. It came from the 19th century Prussian military-industrial state. That's where modern compulsory schooling was born, not to create thinkers, but to create soldiers and factory workers. People who could follow orders. People who wouldn't question authority. People who could be shaped into parts of a larger machine. The goal wasn't critical thinking, it was predictability. And we've inherited that structure without ever questioning it. We still divide kids by age, not ability. But we still teach subjects in isolation, as if life itself were a multiple choice test. We still reward memorization over insight, obedience over originality. Why? Because the system doesn't want revolution, it wants repetition. And when you step back and look at it, it becomes obvious. This isn't education. It's conditioning. Here's the deeper question. If you were designing a system to create citizens who think for themselves, would you make them sit still for 8 hours a day? Would you force them to memorize facts they'll never use, rank them against each other, and punish them for failing to conform? Or would you let them explore, ask questions, build, fail, learn through play, and follow their curiosity? You already know the answer, so why don't we do it? Because that's not what those in power want. Chomsky warns us that real education is dangerous to elites. A population that can think, that can criticize, that can question power and resist manipulation, that's a threat. That's why almost every government and corporation has a stake in keeping education shallow, standardized, and safe. Not safe for children, safe for the system. And if you think this is just about school, think again. The patterns you learn in the classroom follow you into adulthood. You learn not to question authority, so you don't challenge your boss. You learn to compete for grades, so you enter a workforce driven by insecurity. But you learn to seek approval instead of truth, so you become addicted to external validation. The education system doesn't just teach you facts, it teaches you how to live. And the life it teaches you to live is one of quiet obedience. And here's the most tragic part. Most teachers don't even realize they're part of this machine. They care. They work hard. They want to make a difference. But they're too trapped in a system that punishes creativity, underfunds innovation, and rewards conformity at every level. The problem isn't the people, it's the structure. So I'll ask you something that may shake the foundation of how you see your life. What part of you was trained, not educated? What parts of your thinking were shaped not by truth, but by repetition, fear, and reward? And perhaps the most important question of all, what would your mind be like if you had never spent 12 years learning how to obey? Because what Chomsky is really warning us about isn't just a flawed education system. He's pointing to something much deeper, a society that fears free minds. And if we want to change that, we have to start by unlearning the lessons we were never meant to question in the first place. The hidden curriculum, what school really teaches you, without saying it out loud. Let's talk about what school never puts in the syllabus, but teaches you every single day. But it's not just math, science, and literature, it's something far more insidious, far more powerful, and far more invisible. We call it the hidden curriculum. The lessons between the lines. The rules you're expected to obey, not because they're written down, but because they're enforced quietly, constantly, and without explanation. These lessons shape how you see yourself, how you see authority, and ultimately how you live your life. And the terrifying part, most of us never even realized we were taught them. The hidden curriculum begins with obedience. On the first day of kindergarten, you're taught to sit when told, speak when permitted, and ask for permission to use the bathroom. You're rewarded for silence, punished for spontaneity. You learn that the person at the front of the room always knows better, even when they don't. That your job is not to explore, but to absorb. Not to challenge, but to comply. Not to lead, but to follow. And slowly, without anyone saying it directly, you internalize the single most important lesson. Your value comes from how well you perform inside someone else's system. But it doesn't stop there. School teaches you how to measure your self-worth through grades, rankings, and numbers. It tells you that your intelligence, your creativity, your potential, all of it can be reduced to a score. And if you don't fit into that metric system, you're labeled a failure, a problem, a distraction. The bell curve becomes your god, and you learn to fear it. You compete with your peers, not to grow together, but to survive. And beneath that competition lies one unspoken truth. You must earn your right to exist in this world. Now ask yourself, where else in your life have you seen this same pattern? In your job, where performance reviews shape your self-image. In your relationships, where approval feels like a currency. In your online presence, where likes and followers become your identity. These aren't accidents. They're extensions of the hidden curriculum. A curriculum designed not to uplift, but to condition. Not to liberate, but to domesticate. You didn't just learn equations in school. You learned how to be watched, how to be graded, how to be obedient to systems that never explained themselves. Noam Chomsky calls this indoctrination in the service of power. Because when you teach people to accept arbitrary authority in childhood, they're far less likely to question it in adulthood. When you train people to ask permission for everything, they stop imagining a world where permission isn't needed. And when you convince people that failure is shameful, they stop taking risks. You end up with a population that is technically skilled but spiritually broken, productive but disconnected, educated but unfree. Let's go deeper. The hidden curriculum teaches you to distrust your own intuition. It tells you that the answer is always in the textbook, never within. That the experts always know more than you. That your questions are distractions, not doorways. Have you ever wondered why children, who are naturally curious, so often lose that curiosity by the time they graduate? It's not because they grew out of it. It's because it was slowly drained from them, replaced by anxiety, fear of failure, and the need to perform. And here's the part that hurts the most. This isn't just a glitch in the system. It is the system. Because a population that questions everything is dangerous to those in power. And a child who grows into an adult that challenges authority, that thinks critically, that rejects shallow narratives, that's a threat. And so we disguise obedience as education. We call conformity maturity. We reward silence with praise and label resistance as rebellion. The hidden curriculum is not about learning how the world works. It's about learning how to fit into the world without changing it. But what if you could unlearn it? What if you could go back not to erase your past, but to reclaim the parts of yourself that school tried to suppress? Your instinct, your creativity, your ability to question without fear, your right to define your own worth. Because the truth is, the hidden curriculum only works if you accept it. The moment you start to see it for what it is, you begin to break free. You stop measuring your life in grades, promotions, and praise. You start measuring it in truth, alignment, and meaning. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. What beliefs were implanted in you not to help you live, but to help you obey? And what would it feel like to finally let them go? Because once you see the hidden curriculum, you realize that real education doesn't happen in classrooms. It happens when you begin to question the very walls that surround you. The psychology of manufactured consent, how education trains you to accept injustice. There's a moment when you step back from the machinery of education and you realize something deeply unsettling. It's not just that school failed to teach you how to think critically, it's that it actively taught you not to. And worse, it taught you to accept things that should never be accepted. Injustice, inequality, hypocrisy, these aren't just societal problems. They're psychological consequences of conditioning. And the system is designed to make you internalize them so deeply that you no longer see them as problems, but as the way things are. That's what Noam Chomsky meant when he spoke of manufactured consent. It's not about forcing your agreement. It's about shaping your perception so thoroughly that you don't even realize you ever had a choice. Manufactured consent doesn't begin in politics. It begins in the classroom. It begins when a child sees someone being unfairly punished and learns not to speak up. It begins when rules are enforced without explanation, and questioning those rules is punished as disobedience. It begins when children are taught that authority is always right even when it's clearly wrong. And slowly, without you even realizing it, You learn to accept the unacceptable. You learn that power doesn't have to justify itself, and that silence is safer than truth, that your job is not to challenge, but to adapt. Think about how powerful that is. If you wanted to build a society where injustice could thrive without resistance, would you need to censor people? No, you just need to raise them in a way that makes injustice feel normal. And that's exactly what the modern education system does. It doesn't teach you how the world could be. It teaches you how to survive in the world as it is, even if the world is deeply unfair. It replaces imagination with resignation. And once that resignation takes root, it's hard to uproot. People often ask, why don't more people speak out? But the real question is, why were they trained to stay silent in the first place? Why does the average student experience 12 years of schooling without ever being taught how to organize, how to dissent, how to build systems of justice from the ground up? Because silence serves the system. Consent, even if it's unconscious, keeps the machine running. And education is the first place you learn to consent to the rules, to the hierarchy, to the status quo. This is why you can have so many highly educated people who are utterly incapable of seeing the injustice around them. Because education, as it currently exists, doesn't produce wise people, but it produces efficient people, people who can follow complex instructions, people who can operate within a structure, people who can perform tasks without questioning the system that assigned them. And we reward them for it. We call them successful. We put them in suits and give them titles. But we never ask, what kind of mind did they have to silence in order to get here? That's why this goes beyond politics. It's psychological. It's spiritual. It's about your relationship to truth, power, and your own voice. Because once you've been trained to suppress your voice in the classroom, you're far more likely to suppress it in the workplace, in public, in relationships. You start avoiding conflict. You stop asking questions. You start telling yourself, that's just the way it is. And every time you say that, a little part of your freedom dies. But here's the truth that can begin to reverse it all. Consent can be unmanufactured. The same way it was programmed into you, it can be dismantled. Not by rage or rebellion alone, but by awareness. When you start to see how your beliefs were shaped, you can begin to reshape them. When you recognize that normal was never natural, you can imagine something better. You can wake up not just intellectually, but emotionally, morally, spiritually. And when you do, you start to see injustice not as inevitable, but as intolerable. So ask yourself this: what parts of your moral compass were dulled by your education? What truths did you stop speaking because you were trained to be silent? And what injustices have you accepted not because you agreed with them, but because you were taught that resistance was dangerous? Because once you begin to ask those questions, consent is no longer automatic. And that's when real freedom begins. Unlearning the lie, how to reclaim your mind and educate yourself for real freedom if we've been shaped by a system that conditions us to obey, to conform, to accept. Then the real revolution doesn't begin outside. It begins within. It begins the moment you realize that most of what you were told was education was actually programming. That your thoughts weren't always your own. that your silence wasn't always a choice. And if that's true, then here's the uncomfortable truth. Freedom isn't something you're born into. It's something you have to fight to reclaim. And that fight starts with unlearning the lie. So what does real education look like? It doesn't come from institutions. It comes from curiosity. It comes from dismantling the comfortable assumptions you've carried your whole life. It comes from reading the books they never gave you, listening to the voices they silenced, exploring the histories they erased. It comes from asking, who benefits from me believing this? And what would my life look like if I believed something entirely different? Real education is dangerous, and that's exactly why it's powerful. Because once you start educating yourself, you stop being dependent. You stop needing experts to tell you what's true. You stop needing systems to give you value. You become your own authority, not in arrogance but in sovereignty. You stop asking for permission to think, to speak, to act. You stop waiting for someone else to tell you what matters. And in that moment, you begin to live not as a product of the system, but as a free and conscious being. But here's the thing, unlearning is painful, because it means confronting the parts of yourself that were built on lies. It means realizing that some of your beliefs were never yours, but that some of your dreams were handed to you by people who needed you to stay asleep. That some of your fears were implanted to keep you obedient. And when you see that clearly, you may feel anger. You may feel grief. You may feel betrayal. That's normal. That's part of waking up. But don't stop there. Use it. Let that fire burn through the illusions. Let it light the way forward. Because there is a way forward, and it starts with reclaiming your education, not the one you were given, but the one you now choose. Read widely, think critically, question everything, and build your own curriculum. Seek wisdom, not just information. Learn philosophy, history, economics, psychology, not for grades, but for freedom. Learn how systems work so you can stop being ruled by them. Learn how to think so you can stop being told what to think. Learn how to live not as a cog in someone else's machine, but as the architect of your own mind. And then teach others. Share what you've unlearned. Help others see the invisible walls. Start conversations that disrupt comfort. Create spaces where truth can breathe. Because the system can't survive an awakened population. It thrives on silence, isolation, and fear. But when people start unlearning together, something incredible happens. And the system begins to crack. And in those cracks, a new world begins to grow. So I'll leave you with this. What would your life look like if you were educated for freedom, not obedience? And more importantly, what will you do tomorrow to begin that education for yourself before someone else decides your future for you? Because the truth is, you don't need permission to reclaim your mind, but you just need the courage to begin. Right now,